Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I feel strange as an outsider welcoming you all to the Brookings Institution, but I feel strange in an honored and privileged way. So good morning, and welcome to a great program. There's so much talent in the front row here waiting to take the stage. I will keep my own remarks brief. I'm Tom Nagorski from the Asia Society. Delighted to be here, as I said, and I'm going to start with a confession that when I first heard about the book and the concept behind it, Reimagining India, I thought, well, it seems a little bit like a gimmick. You take a whole bunch of great minds, ask them to write you a 3 or 4 page essay, you mash them all together in a collection, and just like that, you have a book. And not just a book, but a book with this lofty title. How could it possibly live up to something called Reimagining India? And then a colleague of mine at the Asia Society in Mumbai said, Tom, why don't you read the book? It's a good idea. And it turns out, and as I now tell anyone who will listen and anyone with even a passing interest in India today, India past, that the concept works. It works on so many levels. Above all, Reimagining India is not just interesting, but it is stimulating, it is provocative. And so from my own standpoint, running programs at the Asia Society, it's basically wandered across our global network, one center at a time. We had 700 people in Mumbai for a program, a great audience and discussion at our headquarters in New York, another in Hong Kong, and every time the conversation is different. Each time the participants are different, the emphasis changes, and of course with each passing month, week, sometimes day, India itself changes, so the conversation changes along with it. We meet now in the midst of this extraordinary exercise in democracy in India, and we meet in the capital of a country that stands to be influenced and affected in many ways by the outcome. It is a moment when candidates and voters and interested parties, like my own colleagues, those of you who work at the Brookings Institution, and those of you who come to hear programs here, are all deeply engaged in reimagining India in one way or another. At the Asia Society, our reimagining of India has taken new shape with the formation of our Policy Institute, which is only 3 weeks old today. The Asia Society Policy Institute was formed on the 8th of April, and when you're that young, you still count the days. Obviously, relations between India and not only the United States, but India and its neighbors and the rest of the nations of Asia will play a big part in our work in that going forward. Here at Brookings, their India project, the DC-based component of the Brookings, its DC-based component is the Brookings India Initiative, which also has a Delhi-based component, the Brookings India Center. This organization is all over all things India. So I thank the Brookings Institution for hosting us today. I'm delighted to be here, excited for the conversation. I do want to acknowledge my colleague Matthew Stump from the Asia Society who's here. Thanks for helping to organize this. Thank you to Otto, who will be up on the stage in a moment. He at McKinsey has been our great partner and really responsible for this great Reimagining India project. And I thank our friends from the Indian government and the Indian embassy, the ambassador who's here, for all your cooperation in so much of our work here in Washington, in Mumbai, in New York, and really around the world. As I was just saying, I had the privilege of moderating an event on the elections at your consulate in New York just a couple of weeks ago. It was a spirited event, as almost all conversations about India today and about the elections tend to be. So I thank you. As I said, I will get out of the way. And it's really my great privilege to introduce, not that many of you need an introduction, to bring to the stage Strobe Talbott, President of the Brookings Institution.
Thanks, Tom. I think it's totally appropriate that you should open the program for all kinds of reasons, including the institutional collaboration that goes on between Brookings and the Asia Society. I want to thank all of you for coming out on this rainy morning. I hope that we'll bring a little bit of light, if not sunlight, to what I think is a project that is actually quite well named. healthy countries are always reimagining themselves. And we'll also have a chance to talk a little bit about what might be salutary in reimagining the Indian-U.S. relationship. Let me just say a quick word about our friend the ambassador, Jaishankar. Jay has been in Washington for a relatively short period of time on this particular assignment, but it must feel like about a decade. He has had his work cut out for him, and he has done that work with extraordinary skill, including in ways that I can only guess at, because he is the ultimate diplomat. As you're about to hear, he is a terrific spokesman, not just for his own government, but also for what is best in the bilateral relationship between his government and the one that he's accredited to here in Washington. I think most of you in the room know a lot about Jay's background. It's pertinent in a number of ways. You know, of course, that he's been in the Indian Foreign Service for a long time, 37 years. Does that sound about right? Does that make you feel fairly senior in the Corps? And he has been posted as India's ambassador to some not only very important capitals, but some capitals that are going to be germane to conversations he'll be having with those of us in the NGO community here, as well as in the government and in the private sector, and I'm thinking particularly here about Beijing. I'm just going to touch on one other feature that maybe isn't always emphasized when Jay is introduced at occasions like this, and I think you'll quickly figure out why I am going to mention it. He was here in the Indian Embassy in the United States in a period during the 80s when we didn't know it at the time, but we were on the cusp of the end of the Cold War. And he also served previous to that, I guess, in Moscow. So he knows firsthand from both capitals what not only the bilateral relationship was between the United States of America and a country that no longer exists, but it may ring a distant bell to all of you, the USSR, which had a lot to do with the context, and I might say a lot that was regrettable about the context of U.S.-Indian relations back during the Cold War. And here he is at a time when we can all say that the Cold War is over, but we cannot say that relations between the United States and Russia are in terrific shape and heading in the right direction. And that might have come up in some ways during our discussion this morning. So that's not to feed you any lines for your opening remarks, Jay, but just a hint of something that I might raise during the course of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Strobe. It's good to be back in Brookings, that too for an India event. And it really gives me great pleasure to join you all today, this morning, for the Washington release of Reimagining India. I'd like to thank McKinsey, Asia Society, and Brookings, of course, whose coming together has made this function possible. Before I deliver the rest of my remarks, I have a confession to make, which is that I've actually read the book. And not all of it at one go, but I would say the good thing about this book is because it's written as a collection of essays, you can read it and put it down and read it and put it down again. And since I spend a lot of time waiting on meetings and staying in airports for aircraft which haven't turned up on time, it's a good companion to have along. Now, those of you who, like me, have had a chance to look through it, I'm sure would agree that it is, these 62 essays really have great value. They are, in many ways, I think, a full spectrum effort which span a variety of issues and challenges. And while addressing them, they do bring to bear a very broad array of approaches. The book is descriptive, but it's also analytical. It's big picture, but it's also sectoral. It highlights problems, but it also, in many cases, suggests solutions. And its tone and texture are really very varied, as indeed are its contributors. And you, when you read the book, you almost have a sense that you walked into a large Indian drawing room, at about 9 o'clock in the night when people are into their second drink. Now, in terms of what I have to say after reading the book, I think the first point I would make is that there couldn't be a better time, at least in Washington, to discuss this book. Because the issues that the book covers are really the very debates of India's 16th general election, which is still unfolding, as many of you know. And if you look at what our political parties are doing in India, they are actually asking the voter to reimagine India, reimagine locally, regionally, nationally. And so whether it is the distribution of power or whether it's the nature of growth, whether it's about vision or implementation, are we talking material issues or intangible values? This book actually captures the internal Indian conversation. And now the vote, as you're all aware, is still underway, and the results are more than a fortnight away. We've seen a high turnout in the election so far, so this could be an indication that these debates actually do resonate with the voters. Now, the overarching theme of the volume is of India's passage to modernity, and it's captured by the subtitle, Unlocking the Potential of India's Next Superpower. And that's really articulated in all its facets by the various authors. Now, it's tempting to find a sweeping explanation for the progress on that journey. But I do take into account Yasheng Huang's very valid caution in this book that the relationship between political systems and economic outcomes is ambiguous and indeterminate. But as Strobe told you, having lived in the USSR, the US, China, Japan, Singapore, and of course India, it's very difficult to resist the temptation of saying something about what helps or doesn't help nations to go forward. And my take on that is actually the subjective element, what I'd call the human factor. China, where I was till recently, is to my mind in many ways example of leadership quality. And not surprisingly, it has today the most serious leadership training program in the world. In contrast, the USSR collapsed primarily due to loss of faith. Japan's stagnation, I believe, and it's interesting because this series began with a book, Reimagining Japan. Japan's stagnation, I think, was a mix of risk aversion and lack of imagination. While Singapore, on the other hand, is really an extraordinary story of vision and willpower. US, of course, we all know, is about openness and optimism, or occasionally lack of it. But when it comes to India, we are told that our strengths are in our diversity and in our improvisation skills. Now, I'm not disputing the merits of the first, but the downside of a Plan B culture is that its commitment to Plan A is rarely as dedicated as it should be. The magnitude of challenges brought out by this volume leaves little doubt for the need of a serious and sustained response to all the challenges in the book. Now, if you're still searching for correlations, I would actually point, and this is my Indian gene here speaking, I would really point to Harsha Bhogle's essay on cricket, which is actually improbably instructive. It connects national sports and nationhood, reminding me of Frank Zappa's famous statement that all you need for a country is an airport, a beer, and a football team. Now, substitute cricket for football, and you actually get the story of modern India's evolution. to cut a long tail short, that is one of graduating from playing safe to wanting to win. So taking risks is as much part of going up the ladder as is serious application. Obviously, not all parts of the book are easy to accept. I can imagine the reaction of many Indians when charged with not having an open mind, which of course proves the point of the author. Today, it's just as important for Indians to realize our shortcomings as it is to wake up to how the world perceives us. At the end of the day, we will be judged by how we pass the twin tests of ambition and performance, or if you prefer Kishore Mahbubani's term, imagination. Finally, if we are reimagining India, perhaps we could also reimagine the Indo-US relationship. It is an important factor in the future development of India, and it awaits its next quantum leap patiently. Now, since all successes need a sequel, at least in Hollywood and Bollywood, I hope McKinsey will give the reimagining Indo-US relationship a thought. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much, and I must congratulate you for your diligence in reading the book. Thank you. I'd like to just introduce the panelists and give you a little bit of background on the book, and then we'll quickly get to the substance at hand. We have actually quite an amazing group of folks here who are authors or participants in the book. First, Strobe Talbott is going to join us because Strobe has been involved with India for a very long time, was a great guide to us during the book, during the writing of the book, and actually 3 authors from Brookings are part of the list of authors in the book. So I think it's fantastic that we have Strobe. As you know, Strobe was a journalist, although he says he's never given up being a journalist. Is that right? Once a journalist, you're always a journalist. But in this case, I get to ask the question. So I think I feel good about that. Strobe has, of course, been in the State Department for many years, and for the last 10 years has been president of Brookings. And Brookings, as you know, has opened the India Center, and Brookings is outstanding in many, many fields. I think you said on many different areas, Brookings is rated as the #1 think tank in the world, policy institute in the world. So we are delighted to have Strobe. If I could request Strobe for you to come. Another Brookings author that I'd like to welcome on stage is Steve Cohen. I am embarrassed because Steve has been following India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan for something like 45 years and speaks, I don't know how many languages. You said you speak Dari and Urdu and Pashto and... Just 2. Oh, just 2, okay. And actually has the benefit of having watched this over a long period of time, and we're delighted because Steve also wrote a wonderful essay for the book in terms of how India's foreign policy might evolve. And I'd finally like to invite Chris Graves. For those of you who read the book, the last essay, the closing essay in the book is written by Chris. And Chris was the architect, has been in the media business, and was a journalist and was involved in setting up CNBC, and then, of course, runs one of the largest media firms in the world. And I won't ask you which political ads you've done in this campaign. You can. Oh, we'll ask you when you come up here. But he was involved in the campaign that India did called Incredible India, which many of you might have seen. So Chris, we're delighted if you could come here. I'm just going to spend 2 minutes on the book, the notion of the book. And really, this is not about book. This is not about the book. This is about India. The idea for the book came about because for many of you who follow India or are Indians, 2 years ago, the mood about India around the world and also in India was extraordinarily depressing, which was a huge contrast to the mood 5 years ago about India, which was incredibly euphoric. And as several people have remarked about India and Indians, we tend to be extraordinarily bipolar. When things are good, we are on top of the moon, and when things are bad, we are just at the bottom. And actually, neither of those is the appropriate way to think about India. It's a very large, complicated, diverse country, and we are on a 50-year development path. And during that path, some things will go well, some things will go badly, but we can't slow down from that development path. So when we found that the mood around the world and the discussions around the world were as depressing as they were, we thought what could we do to elevate the dialogue, to give people a broader sense of the broad path that needs to be taken, the challenges that can be overcome and how they can do that, and so that through that dialogue, the discussion about India could change. That was the idea. And we thought that if we wrote a series of essays, not many people would read it. They would be very dense, they'd have lots of charts and lots of numbers, and very few people would read it. And so the idea came about that we should do a book that had 62 essays by lots of observers about India. It's 50% Indian, 20% diaspora, and 30% international. And that let's get a broad view from all of these folks about what will it take for India to unlock the potential, which, lots of people said, you've had the potential for 50 years and we're tired of talking about potential, how can you get there? So that was the idea of the book. I don't want to, because it's 62 essays, it's impossible to give a theme other than it talks about the development of India. So I don't want to go into telling you what the book says. I'll leave it to you to read it and get a flavor for it. But what I thought we could do today is, given that we have people who are very familiar with the book and 2 authors, and 3 authors have written 1 essay, we could explore parts of the book. Because this is Washington, obviously, we will explore certain parts that have to do with policy and foreign policy and others, but that's what we will do today. And the way this will go is I'll ask a question of each of the panelists to expand on one topic, which for about a few minutes, for about 5 minutes each. Then I'll ask them a series of very specific questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. And as Strobe reminded me, the Brookings rules are you have to ask a question, you can't make a speech, and it has to be a short question, and then we will ask the panelists to answer. So with that, let me just start off right away. And I wonder if I could start with you, Strobe. I think you'll have mics there, right?
We're mic'd.
Good. I wonder if I could start with you. Strobe, you've watched India's foreign policy for 20 years. You've been involved with it from the US side, both as, in the Department of State and then watching it. You've worked with governments of all types. As you look ahead and potentially a change in government, which there will be some change in government in any case, no matter how the election results come out, how do you see India's foreign policy evolve? Does a change in government make a difference in the foreign policy? What directions would you like to see the US-India dialogue improve? And what role could one see India play that it is not playing today? And what role should it not play as it goes forward? Since you've had day-to-day experience of this, I wonder if you could expand on that.
Thank you, Adil. And let me also thank you for your personal friendship and your institutional friendship, and for being a part of both what we're doing here in the U.S. and what we're doing under the aegis of Brookings India and the Brookings India Center, which, while based in Delhi, is reaching out to the entire country, and we're going to have a network of relationships there. There are a number of people I see in the room who have been helpful to us and who will want to engage in that. Let me, Adil, in response to your question, start with a general proposition which picks up on something that you just said in your excellent opening remarks. When I was looking at Ambassador Jaishankar and recalling the past, one way to characterize the past, which was a decades-long period of missed opportunities and almost, it seemed at times, perversely deliberate misunderstanding of each other, that was when the world could be described as a bipolar system. Bipolarity is a disease. It means manic depression. And bipolarity is not a healthy condition either for a national psyche, if I can put it that way, the way a society imagines itself. Yeah. For going from euphoria to depression, you even use the word depression. And I think when it wasn't that long ago that the slogan "Shining India" was used in a campaign, although my recollection is that the campaign didn't turn out the way those who used the slogan hoped. And there has been, as those of us who regard ourselves as friends of India, been something of a up and down mood swing. And by the way, as you also alluded to, and I think Jay did as well, the same is true in the United States. We're a country that prides itself on optimism, except when we don't. And I think we're a bit in the latter state now. So this is yet another something that the world's oldest and the world's largest democracies have in common. And bipolarity, there's some symptoms of bipolarity in the bilateral relationship. And I have seen that in the 20 plus years that I've been working most intensely in India, with India, and with my colleagues here at Brookings about India. So I would say that the relationship needs to be smoothed out. A colleague of ours, known to many of you in the room, Tanvi Madan, who couldn't be with us today, says that what we really need is a constructive, pragmatic, purpose-oriented sense of normalcy in the relationship, which depends on a lot of things. It certainly depends on leaders, and we'll come to that. I'll come to that in a moment, and also professionals, particularly professional diplomats, and most particularly the ambassadors of each country and the other, to have a sense of what is calming and what will lead us to the right kind of normalcy. And you have been terrific at that, including in the way that you handled your baptism by fire when you arrived in your new post. But I think that those of us in the NGO community and in the private sector can play our own role, and I might add the media as well. As a unrepentant journalist, let me put it that way, I find the Indian media to be both exhilarating and infuriating, and that's very much on the record, as is everything, I think, in this conversation this morning. And there's nothing to be done about that. There's no government policy, obviously, that's going to change it. But there are, on both sides, journalists who know the other country quite well, and I would hope, knowing a number, and I think that this is, there is a critical mass of people in the media who understand that they can play a constructive role through both constructive criticism of both sides, but also keeping the big picture in mind. And the big picture, which I think Jay alluded to in his opening remarks, is a positive picture. And that goes, and also there, despite the mood swings in each of the two countries, and both of them are, well, I would say there's a sense of excitement in India, maybe tinged with apprehension in some quarters, because you are about, if the polls are any indication, almost certainly going to move into a period of change. And that would probably be true whatever the outcome of the election, but particularly if the election goes in the way that so many of the polls indicated. So in India, there is a sense that there's a new opportunity coming. And as often happens with opportunity, it will come with some risks. The change may not please everybody as being for the better, but at least there's a sense of something about to change. Here in the United States, we're still a couple of years off from our next major change, which will be a change no matter what the outcome is of our 2016 elections. And here in the US, there is a sense that the federal government, which includes, of course, well, I guess you could say all three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, are stuck. They're stuck in partisanship. And what that means is that fewer and fewer Americans are looking to their government to change things for the better. Let's say a change we can believe in. But that in turn, because of the vitality of the United States, creates opportunities for governance and communities below the national and federal level, which is to say at the state level and the metropolitan level. And I think one of the many positive things going on in U.S.-Indian relations is that in addition to cabinet officers and that kind of thing going back and forth between the two countries, you now have governors and mayors going in both directions, chief ministers from Indian states, including Indian states that are not historically known for having much of a outreach to the world. A colleague of mine, Bill Antholis, has written a book on the devolution of power and political power in both China and India to the provinces in the case of China and the states. And I would say that is basically a positive development, although it's going to be one that cannot be by definition coordinated from the center, but should be encouraged by all of us. The last thing I would say, which I think was implicit, if I understood your question, I have had a chance during my adventure as a public servant to deal both with a Congress-led government in the early 90s and with a BJP-led government at the end of that decade. And what I was struck by in both cases, and this was Prime Minister Rao, of course, in the beginning, and Prime Minister Vajpayee at the end, there was a high degree of continuity. Now, I'm not saying anything here for the first time publicly. I wrote a book about it. The personification of the Indian government that I dealt with was Jaswant Singh, who remains a very positive and admirable character in my own book, as it were. But I think that the fact that he and his counterparts in the American government were able to get the U.S.-Indian relationship over a hump that had been there for decades indicated that ideology, even though occasionally there were reminders that the ethos of the non-alignment movement was still there, it was still possible for India and the United States to get on the right side of the post-Cold War era. And we can probably circle back to that in the course of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask next Steve Cohen to talk about India's evolving relationship and what do you see over the next few years in terms of India's, as you mentioned before, and you mentioned in your essay in the book, it's a very dangerous neighborhood, right? There's Pakistan, there's Afghanistan, Central Asia, China that surround India on the north, and the Indian Ocean where lots of things are being played out. And therefore, lots of things can happen in that. So in that environment, what do you see happening in terms of relationships between India and its various neighbors? And what do you see happening as the US reduces its role in Afghanistan?
One of the most important and interesting Chinese sayings, which turns out to be a forgery, is that where there's danger, there's opportunity. There's a whole website devoted to this Chinese character. But there is an opportunity for India. And if I was to rewrite the essay now, I would point to the opportunities that India may take advantage of rather than worry about the dangers. India's been obsessed with the dangers in the neighborhood, including from the US at one point. I think they'll look at the opportunities. I think Modi, in fact, would I rewrite the essay, and I know more about Modi and his strategy now than I did before. And I would say that, to summarize it, India has not squeaked at all, and squeaky wheels get greased. And India hasn't squeaked, and I think India is going to be squeaking loud. That is, it's going to be doing things, some risky, some dangerous, some positive.
A lot of people have said Indians are argumentative and noisy, but I've never heard squeaky.
Well, they're going to be squeaking, and I think American policy is going to have to reconsider its attitude towards India. Since Strobe's time, India, South Asia, except for Afghanistan, it's been viewed as flyover country. And as a Midwesterner, I know what it means to be in flyover country. there they go, from San Francisco to Washington, back and forth. But India is going to attract more attention, and America has to adjust to that, I think, both administratively and politically and strategically, and it hasn't so far. I think that the big change that I see is that we've all thought that Modi would transform India's economy. I think that's true. He will try to do that if it is a Modi government. But I think that's going to give him more muscle and leverage in foreign policy. And the key country is China plus Japan and Korea. Modi has close relations with China, Japan, and North and South Korea. Bad relations with the US. And I think that he's going to expand this into a strategic advantage for India. That is, he's going to use the economic relationship he has with East Asia, especially China, to enhance Indian power elsewhere. In a sense, the original Nehruvian dream of India becoming one of the 5 or 6 major countries in the world, I think he's going to try to implement that. And I think his goal is to be prime minister for more than one term, so he can complete that. And I think his role model, obviously, is Sardar Patel, also a congressman, but a much tougher man than Nehru is. So I think he'll be tougher towards China, but more cooperative with China. He'll use the new relationship with China to gain influence over Pakistan, over the United States, and generally, and to gain the muscle that India becomes a military as well as a talking power. So I think that's going to be the thrust of his strategy. How the Americans respond to that, I'm not sure. I think so far, again, it's seen as flyover country. So I think that you will see major changes in foreign policy. The domestic side is another issue. I think the big question is whether Modi and the Indian Constitution can get along with each other. Indira Gandhi pushed the limits on that during her emergency, and clearly she pulled back. But I think that there'll be tests of that sort. But it's going to be more than simply an economic policy. Economics will come first, led by investments from China, Japan, Korea. And that's going to give India, I think, more strength and capability. And I wouldn't be surprised if China doesn't become I won't say the regional manager, play a role between India and Pakistan. It's in China's interest to see normal relations between India and Pakistan. Chinese have a huge investment in Pakistan, enormous political and economic as well as military. So I think their view may be, and again, Ambassador Jaishankar would be able to answer this better than I can, will the Chinese eventually see themselves not as the broker in the region, but as seeing two friends not being able to get along together and perhaps ease their relationship. In a sense, China could play the role that I imagine for them of the U.S. playing, but I don't see anybody in the U.S. seeing that role.
And you didn't mention Afghanistan. You didn't comment on Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think the question of the American withdrawal of Afghanistan is a big issue in India, Pakistan, and of course China. I was in Delhi twice this year, and I was cornered by people in various government agencies. What's going to happen in Afghanistan? I don't know any more than they do. But clearly a bad withdrawal from Afghanistan could trigger more chaos in Pakistan and then more chaos in India. I think that's the Indian fear, I think legitimate fear, and the Chinese fear, that a deteriorating Pakistan, and it's on a downward trajectory, could create more extremism in China and also in India. And that would be of interest to the Chinese and the Indians, and of course to the Americans. So that's why they're worried about how much of a presence we'll maintain in Afghanistan. To sort of course, our failure in Afghanistan goes back 15 years now. The failure to construct a regional strategy where the Iranians, the Chinese, and the Indians, and the Pakistanis would all collaborate in creating sort of a neutral or non-aligned Afghanistan. But that may be too late, but I would still have hope that could be revived.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, I think some of the discussion from both the panelists said or took for granted that there would be some improvement in economic activity and that India's, over a 5, 10, 15-year period, the economy gets big enough that it can, it has some weight, right? On the other hand, over the last few years, the economy has actually deteriorated quite a lot. And this dream of incredible India doesn't really apply anymore, right? It was more like depressed India, as we talked about before. What do you see over the next couple of years for India to re-achieve its economic growth? And I would just add one editorial comment to that, which is, at least from our perspective and the perspective of many people in the book, the real purpose of economic growth was not necessarily how it applied to foreign policy or how it applied to the league tables of the world GDP, right? But it was that every point of GDP growth raises another 10 million families out of poverty. And in the last 7 years, 140 million people came out of poverty. It's the largest poverty reduction India has ever seen and the world has ever seen except for China. And so, economic growth makes a huge difference in the way people live and the effect it has. And we've seen that with 140 million people. So what do you see happening over the next few years such that in the next 7 years, maybe another 200 million people come out of poverty?
First of all, I'd ask a question. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for coming, and McKinsey and Brookings and Asia Society, and thank you for coming out on a miserable, endless winter here in Washington, D.C. this year. I appreciate it greatly. How many of you who are not from India actually have spent time in India? Just raise your hands.
A lot.
Fair amount. I would ask you to think back to your very, very, very first impression when you first went to India. And I'll come back to that in a minute as you think on that, because if it was anything like mine 21 years ago to go build a television news network there, it is overwhelming in so many different ways. And what India has done to try to capture that for the world outside of India, to create a kind of brand that might lure foreigners to visit India as tourists, which is, by the way, tourism should not be dismissed as a nice to have. Tourism is crucial. It's crucial for capturing foreign exchange. It's crucial for investment when you get hospitality, travel, companies investing from the outside. Tourism often can lead the way. It can create 1 out of 10, perhaps 1 out of 8 jobs in a giant nation like India. So it's very, very, very important. So one part of that we came to address in 2002 was what Mark Twain faced in 1896. Mark Twain was dead broke after being successful. Dead broke. He made 2 miserable investments, not unlike today, both in media. And one was in publishing and one was in a new typesetting kind of machine. And he lost his shirt. And he needed, before he died, out of integrity and a need to not leave his heirs impoverished, to go on a world tour lecturing to recover and pay off his creditors. He was very full with integrity that he wanted to fully pay them off. They said, just give us pennies and no, I'll fully pay you off. So he decided to go on this world tour, and he spent 3 months of that world tour in India. And when he arrived, the same man who was so capable of distilling complex notions into one single pithy phrase or sentence was totally at a loss. He succumbed to an exclamation mark and said, "Indeed, this is India." And he just rattled on a litany of opposites and contrasts, which had now become sort of a stereotype of India. But we tried to, if you think of branding, how important that is for companies, whether it's a Nike or an Apple, it's really important for countries too, and a country's economy. Not only to mobilize its own people behind a vision, but foreigners investing back in that country. So you alluded to, in 2002, my company, Ogilvy, worked with the government to create something called Incredible India, just like Mark Twain. Who knows? How do you put this all together? It's incredible. And the only problem with that is, while that's highly seductive for tourism, it's really off-putting for foreign investors. Foreign investors want credible. They don't want incredible. And they may be dull and they may be blinkered, but this is an important thing that they need. So for a couple of ideas to knit together, Strobe, you mentioned Bill Antholis' book, Inside Out, which is, I think, spot on in terms of how India and China are headed. We do work in both India and China for the last 30 years or so or more. In fact, David Ogilvy went to India 50 years ago to start India Ogilvy there. But this notion of the devolution, this stronger states, the rise of the states, is a very powerful thing. But it also undermines the notion of a nation as a brand. Because if you think about, Brand USA, there is such a thing, by the way, Brand USA, it often becomes an aggregation of many states and resorts rather than just a country. But off the top of your head, there are many things that you would think of that make you feel America. You could convey that often through Hollywood. India has done that, could do that, through 2 things I've discovered in the last 21 years. If you don't understand cricket and you don't understand Bollywood, you don't get India. It is so powerful, and that's not meant to be dismissive. These are very powerful things. They're metaphors in everything that India does. So pulling these notions together, you've seen recently a wave of foreign direct investments start to come in, portfolio investments starting to come back into the stock markets. The last couple of days have been rough, but there's some optimism about change. Why? What change would foreign investors hope to see in this combination of a devolution into states and perhaps a change in government? A couple of things. They're connected. One, foreign investors see Gujarat as a state as very business friendly. Very business friendly. They see their chief minister, therefore, by extrapolation, as business friendly. And this is, of course, Narendra Modi, who is hoping to be the next prime minister of India. The problem, again, for branding is you can't knit these together in India, so I would suggest that there's a notion that worked for tourism and still will work for tourism of an incredible India as a brand to foreigners, cannot work for foreign direct investment. It has to be state by state by state, as its own personality, as its own brand. And I think there what you're going to find are real league tables that they've already developed in India, league tables of winners and losers. Now it sounds harsh, it sounds hugely, cruelly capitalistic, but that's what's happening in India now. Just like cricket is a league table of winners and losers state by state. I think if you're going to, the foreign direct investment has never been what it could have been in India, compared to China, for example. And India itself will point to its own brand as being the world's largest democracy, which it is, and younger than China, which it is. The demographics are radically different from China, but they're also radically different in that 2/3 of India is agrarian, and China urbanized very rapidly, and through urbanization forced education, and has a very different manufacturing base for its economy that India does not have. And so if you're a foreign investor looking to build a giant business in India, what do you need? What do you not get? The single biggest frustration and fear of foreign investors is inconsistency. They can live with a bad consistency, but they just need a consistency. And so they've seen reversals of reversals of reversals. I think if you were to chart through as a foreign investor or business person, you lose track of the number of times policies have been reversed at a federal level, but not necessarily at a state level. And so I think you're going to see foreign investors sort of give up on the notion of an India, incredible India, or a credible India, but go state by state, picking winners and losers, which is going to make it a really interesting playing field over the next 10 years.
I think just one comment on foreign direct investment, if I may. I think from 1993 to 2002, foreign direct investment in India was roughly 2 billion a year.
Yeah.
It was between 1 and 3 billion a year, but it was roughly 2 billion a year. From 2004 to 2011, or 2010, it went from 3 billion to 48 billion. And then it dropped starting in 11 to 27 billion.
Yeah.
And it's now coming back up again.
Well, you just had it in the news again. I mean, with the multi-brand retail, if you know what that is, that's like a Walmart, right, is a multi-brand retailer. And the rules under the current administration had changed, and it was very contentious, very tough victory, but they got to a point where foreign investors could own 51% of a multi-brand retailer. The new manifesto of the BJP has come out saying, we will overturn that it is bad for jobs for Indians in that. The BJP has also come out with a manifesto saying that they want a brand India that is 5 T's, and forgive me, I haven't memorized all the 5 T's yet, but I'll read them to you very quickly here. They are talent, tourism, tech, trade, and tradition. There's nothing to object to there. How could you? I would counter that as a strategy for foreign investors, they actually need 5 C's, possibly a 6th. Credibility, consistency, corruption-free, contract rule of law, construction of a 21st century infrastructure, and the 6th it has to be cricket. Metaphorically, from the point of rules, if any of you know cricket,
winning World Cup again, or
well, certainly, maybe it's not bidding 14 crore for an IPL all-rounder for those of you who follow cricket, but it has to be playing by the rules of cricket in terms of decency, civility, integrity.
Okay, so we will look forward to your 5C campaign right after this after this election is over.
Full disclosure, we are fully vested in this election through work. We have worked for the India government, we have worked for the Gujarat government, and we are working for one of the parties right now.
Okay, good. So that's helpful to understand. Sorry, I'm destroying my mic. I hope you can hear me. I wanted to come back to a couple of questions for each of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I think, Strobe, one of the things you said is that you saw amazing consistency across different governments in terms of foreign policy. But you also talked about the fact that there is a chance to take the bilateral relationship between India and the US to the next level, right? That it is at a certain level. Would be helpful to define what is the next level and what would it take to get there?
Well, I'm going to keep my answer at a fairly high level of generality, but perhaps in the discussion we can get into some specifics. And I hope I can get the tonality of what I'm about to say about India's, insofar as you can generalize about such a large and diversified country, India's sense of its role in the world. I think in a way that is in some ways perhaps very Indian and in other ways a little surprising, India is underestimating the extent to which it really is now a global player. It is not just a regional player. And even getting from being a, shall I say, having a kind of a moat psychology back before then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh opened up the India economy, there has been great progress in the way that India has gone out into the big world and invited the big world in, particularly in the economic, trade, and business sectors. But with regard to both, well, particularly geopolitics of the 21st century, which involves a large measure of geoeconomics, I see a reticence or perhaps a lack of sufficient consensus on how that role should be played. The G20, and those who are not in the G20 don't appreciate this description of it, but the G20 is the closest thing we have to a board of directors of the world. Unelected by the 195 as a whole, but nonetheless it plays that role. And India is there. India is also the I in the Goldman Sachs acronym BRICS, which means that it has a major role to play in what used to be called the developing world, although so much of India now qualifies as a developed country. And yet, and here I go to, perhaps because of the prejudice of my own experience, to the big geopolitical issues that we are facing. How to deal respectfully, constructively, and realistically with the emergence of China. And now I'm going to get to something I hinted at from the lectern, how to deal with a Russia that, like Walter White, is breaking bad. I'm looking around the room to see if I'm getting any recognition there. And these are both countries that India has long history with. In the case of Russia, a friendly history. In the case of China, a fraught history. And what we, the United States, have in common with India is that of the four countries, we are the two real democracies. And I think that there are going to be a raft of opportunities if American statesmanship is handled properly going forward, and if India steps up to the plate. That is not a cricket term, of course. Steps up to the plate.
Crease. You can say steps up to the crease.
And thinks of itself as a major league world power.
Okay. No, I think that's very helpful. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about, one of the underlying, many of its actions in foreign policy are based on an economy that continues to grow and becoming a pretty good, strong power economically. What do you see from the from the environment side that could actually get in the way of that economic growth? External factors, forget about internal factors for a second. Some people have mentioned that, with a new government, there could be a rise of communal tensions. That is obviously something that could affect the economy. That a collapse or things happening in Pakistan could actually affect the Indian economy. For the last 10 years, nothing external, other than in the business side, has affected the Indian economy, realistically. The business side has affected it, and other economies slowing down has affected it, but the neighborhood has not really affected it. But do you see any risk on that?
Yeah, with apologies to Don Rumsfeld, there is a known unknown, and the known unknown is what extremists would do in Pakistan, or based in Pakistan, or in possibly even India, to break up any normalization between India and Pakistan, or even India and China. We've seen this in the past with the case of Mumbai and other events, where the extremists, in that case Pakistanis, possibly allowed by the Pakistan government, really attacked Mumbai and did a lot of other damage, also the Indian Parliament, series of events in the hope of breaking up the peace process, normalization process. So I think that's the known unknown. So the Indians and Pakistanis in particular have to understand that as they move down the road towards normalization, if they do, and I think this is something the Chinese have an interest in. Chinese have a strong interest in a normal Pakistan. Then there will be groups that try to disrupt this relationship, mostly in Pakistan, conceivably in India. There was one case where a radical Hindu group actually attacked a Hindu procession to create an incident. So I think that's the known unknown. We know it's going to happen. We don't know when it'll happen. So both governments, India, Pakistan, and the rest of the world, have to understand that it will happen and be prepared to just let it go and move on to other things.
And do you think, so let me just push you on the second part of the question that had to do with communal tension within India. What do you see on that?
I think it analogous to Pakistan's nuclear policy. We worry about future behavior, not past behavior. And I think Modi understands very well that he must maintain normalization within India. What his minions do, we're not quite sure, but he's got to keep them under control as well. In the case of Pakistan, clearly the analogous to Pakistan's past bad behavior in nuclear areas. So I think he will be more worried about future behavior, which would lead to pogroms against Muslims in India. I don't think that's going to be his policy. He correctly argues in defense. Well, whatever we did in 2002, look at the Congress did in 1964 or 1990, what did they do against Sikhs? So I think 2 wrongs.
1984.
1984. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and I think he should be concerned about the future. Again, that's a point.
Could I just add a footnote to that? When Chris asked people in the room who are not Indian, who spent time in India, a lot of hands went up and some hands didn't. But I'm going to assume that everybody here, even if he or she has never been to India, has an image of India. I don't know if Sunil Kilnani's book, The Idea of India, was yet another inspiration in addition to Nandan Nilekani's book.
Called Reimagining India.
Yeah,
right.
But I mean, India and the United States have something else in common. And that is we're not nation states. We're more than just multi-ethnic or multi-nation states. We're idea states. And the idea is essentially the same idea. And it is e pluribus unum. It's based on diversity. And it's based on embrace of diversity, tolerance for people of other faiths and ethnicities. And that's, I think, a bond between the two countries that has survived even the lost decades of the Cold War. The aberrations, which I think I see them as aberrations, but tragic and bloody and murderous aberrations that have occurred from time to time, just as outrages that have occurred in the United States based on race and religion, remind us of what the normalcy is, the normalcy of respect for diversity. And I guess Steve mentioned that Chief Minister Modi has a difficult relationship with the U.S. government, as we know, and a less than glowing press in this country. And I think that's because all Americans who pay attention to India, even if they've never been there, have this idea of a tolerant, syncretic, civilizational state. And when something happens or somebody is identified as being part of that problem, it creates some doubt about what that person will do and represent if and when he becomes the leader of the country.
And I would suggest that there's probably a split view of Modi. There is media in general. There is political. There's Capitol Hill. I mean, they revoked his visa in 2005. But then there's the business community, who are maybe a bit more realpolitik. Not that they're going to be callous about things like religious strife. But I think the business community, if you go to a U.S.-Indian Chamber of Commerce type thing, are willing to hope that never happens again and willing to forgive. I think the next version of that it's emerging in India is violence toward women. Mm-hmm. And that is becoming, on a statistical basis, sometimes people look at the violence towards women in India as not a big deal because on a statistical basis, on such a giant country, they would say yes, but there are incidents that the media has grabbed hold of because they're so horrible and lurid. Well, they are horrible and lurid, and there's a behavioral economics principle called the simulation heuristic, and media falls prey to this all the time, that basically if it's very cinematographic, it feels outweighted. It is a problem, though. It is a problem for the image of India. And so a really interesting development on two fronts I've just noticed in the last 6 months there. One is a company, a private sector company, Tata & Sons, have put forward this mission called the Power of 49, reminding women that they're 49% of the vote and that they should make use of this power. The other one is in the BJP manifesto I noticed that they've carved out a huge piece for promotion of women in parliament, reserving 33% of the seats, et cetera. So this, I think they're hoping to move away from, put behind us a little bit of the religious strife and move to the next big problem, which is violence against women.
That's as long as the religious strife can be put behind.
True,
Yes.
true.
Yep. Stephen, please.
Just one sentence. On the Indian side, the danger to Modi, if he becomes chief minister or prime minister, will be from his right and the belief, the theory that America and Britain are in conspiracy against India, trying to undercut India by being anti-Hindu. They cite The Economist editorials and so forth, and saying that there's a plot.
The Economist will be very happy to know that they're so influential.
There's a plot led by Western missionaries to really attack Hinduism and India. And I think there's a danger of a backlash there as well. So I think he's got to defend himself from his right to this extremist position with totally incorrect interpretation of Western policy.
So let me ask you, in the last, as we've done events like this around the globe in the last few months, the book was released in November, and the mood about India in November was quite negative still, especially amongst foreign institutional investors who, and then starting February, it started getting much better. And today the stock market is at an all-time high. In the last 3 months, $20 billion of new money has flowed into India. The total amount of foreign institutional investors, which is in equities in India, is now at 240 billion. Last year it was at 160. Just by comparison, before the Indian economy opened up in 91, the total foreign institutional investment in India was 5 billion. Right? So it has come a long way. Do you think, so I want to ask all three of the panelists, we talked about the fact that when things were going well in India, we were incredibly euphoric, then we were incredibly depressed. Are we getting incredibly euphoric again? Can you see that things are going to improve so much?
No, I would say the volatility is still quite there. If you look in the last week, there was one day when there was 1.5 billion withdrawal from credit markets. And the stock market, though, since the beginning of the year, is up about 7% compared to about 1% on the S&P, for example. It's been doing pretty well. There could be a real either buyer's remorse or the stock market. If you follow the stock market, it's buy on the rumor, sell on the news is the maxim. And so I think once they know who is elected, it doesn't mean that they will pass judgment on that candidate so much as they'll say it's done now. we got to get out of this market because it's ramped up quite a bit. So I would expect to see a sell-off, but I would not read that as a long-term problem for opportunities in India.
Yeah, I think that at least American visions of India are sort of captured or surrounded, and we still see it as flyover country. When I was a student, I learned that cows cast communism and corruption in Congress. Were the
Oh, your 5 Cs.
And add counter-proliferation to that also. So I think that we tend to view India in view of a category, whether it's the saintly divine Hindu, whether it's Congress and so on, or whether it's non-proliferation or human rights. In a sense, we don't see India strategically. We see India in parts. I think that's a problem with American policy. We make policy in terms of different attitudes and regions, not a strategic policy. India's been guilty of that also, but I think they're coming around to a position of sort of strategic calculation. Partly this has to do with our bureaucracies.
I guess I'll just make an ancillary point. My impression is that this election in India is getting more attention in the United States than any in a very long time. Would you agree with that,
Yeah.
Chris? Which I think is basically a good thing. We Americans have, broadly speaking, over the decades and in our millions, have not paid as much attention to India as we should. More Americans are paying attention to it. Of course, whether it's a good or bad thing depends on two things. One, are they paying attention to the truth and factual representations of what's going on and solid analysis? And given the state of the American media, that's a challenge. And second, if they are looking at the real situation, then it'll be a good thing if good things happen in India and things that are conducive to business confidence, a more forthcoming attitude towards investment in India, and also a growing sense that the basis is solid for a strengthening of the U.S.-Indian relationship.
So you wanted to say something?
Well, the problem is that, as I said, squeaky wheels don't get greased. Every time India goes to the polls, it's the largest single organized event in human history. And that gets you zero attention here.
Organized to a point.
Well, actually, quite better organized than our
It's
election.
quite organized. Yes.
No hanging chads.
And,
The results will come out very fast.
So I think that India's going to squeak because it's going to have new economic policies, new foreign policies. I think that's going to make a huge difference in American attitudes. But there'll be a time lag before that happens.
I think one of the other interesting aspects of this election is the number of first-time voters. And America looking at the demographic shifts between even 08 and 12 and the impact on electoral here. And looking at India, seeing that as many as 150 million first-time voters in India, and what is their mindset as Indian millennials? And it's the first social media election as well. So this pulls together the coverage between the United States and India in a way that had never been pulled together before. Also that narrative of dynasty on the one hand versus T-seller on the other. And some of the media looking back this direction wondering, is the next election in the United States going to be a Clinton, Bush, or other dynasty versus a T-seller in the United States?
Coffee seller.
Coffee seller, perhaps.
So I just want to add two comments on the election since I think the ambassador also mentioned this, but just as you all are following it. One is that in fact a very large number of people, new voters, it's actually about 110 million new voters that we don't know how they will vote. There's a lot of speculation about that. Second, that in fact the turnout this time, I think the ambassador mentioned this, is roughly 10% higher than it has been last time. It's a very, very high turnout compared to anything. And even in Bombay, which is is notorious for having very low turnout. I think in the last election, the turnout there was 41%. This year was 51%. And in the rest of India, it's over 63%. So it's a very, very high turnout, and we'll see what that means.
And is the increase in one demographic?
It's across the board. It's across the board. And since exit polling is allowed in India, but they're not allowed to discuss the results of the exit polling till May 16th, and the election results are announced, we don't know some of these things, right? We will find out a little more about exactly the exact demographic that voted and all of that in different areas. But I think it is very interesting. I wanted to just add two things on the election for the benefit of our audience. One is, it's the first election in which several US consulting firms who were involved in the last election here are actually playing a role. So several folks from the Obama campaign who did all of the high-tech social media number crunching stuff are actually in India, working with different parties to help them figure this out. Several election consultants from the US are also out there. We don't know if it'll make any difference or not, but they're certainly there. And we'll see how that works. But it is also one of the elections where social media is playing an extraordinarily important role. In many rural parts of India, in the last election, less than 10% of people had mobile phones. In this election, roughly 40 to 50% of the rural population, city everyone has it, has mobile phones. And so the amount of spending on social media has actually been quite interesting. And since it's the first time that's happening to that extent, we don't know what we don't know what impact it will have. Everyone has their own story about what impact it will have. So let me ask you, since you are several journalists here, and many of you have mentioned media, I want to make one comment and then ask you a question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. One comment is that while the US has roughly 6 or 7 24-hour-a-day news channels, does that be right? 6 or 7?
Sounds right.
8? 5? Okay.
Five.
I think in
The
India,
fact we
last
don't know tells you something.
Yeah.
Yes,
Or don't care.
right.
Yeah.
In India, currently, there are 87 24-hour-a-day news channels, if you count all regional media. So part of the reason why there's such intense media interest is if you have 87 channels who have to get content 24 hours a day, you have to fill it with something.
Yes.
And politicians talking about things is a good way to fill that content. So there's a lot. Second comment that I'll make is for those of you who think that Fox News and MSNBC is tough on their guests, right? I would invite you to watch Arnab Goswami skewer their guests on any of the panels. This is an unusually well-behaved panel because nobody's yelling and cutting anyone
Not yet,
off.
so it's not over
Not
yet.
yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, right.
What did you say?
Right. If Arnab was interviewing you, you would have a very hard time, believe me, and people would be getting their attention. But as a result of that, actually almost, because there are so many channels, almost any aspect of the election and almost any aspect of people comes on some news channel or the other. That's not to say it gets a majority, it doesn't get a majority of it, but almost anything can be developed on any of the news channels. So having seen that, I'm now going to ask you the question, since all of you have traveled to India and all of that. Is India media tougher than Fox and MSNBC?
First, I'm sorry.
You started one
I've
of them.
started one of them. I apologize. 20 years ago or so, partnered with Raghav Bahal, and we created CNBC TV 18. I worked with Ronnie Screwvala, Pranoy Roy, Pratish Nandi, all the titans of media back in that day, most of whom are still alive, some thriving, some bankrupt, I think. But just a little color commentary to understand where that came from. In 93, 94, 95 period, I don't believe there was any cable-related law at that point.
No.
So the technology had come before the regulation. And there were 100,000 cable companies at that point in India. And the rule was that basically you can't cross a highway with your cable because you might delay traffic, but otherwise fair game, string your cable anywhere. And the competitive strategy was to cut your competitors' cables and blow up their head-end stations. Quite literally, blow up their head-end stations. This is a kind of precursor for what came in terms of media aggressiveness later. In 1 year, while I was there, 1 year, 22 new 24-hour television stations started in 1 year. And so clearly, I looked at that and said, let's see how many are going to be alive in a year.
And they multiplied.
And they multiplied, and they multiplied. So the good news is it's incredibly vibrant. You can get anything in India. In fact, in print, India was one of the earliest in newspapers on the planet. And so it's always had this incredibly vibrant media in India. That's the good side. The bad side is you lead with assertion and allegation and nobody heard your clarification. So you just attack. The other thing is it's so numbing. If you go, next time you go, sit in the hotel room or somebody's house and change the channel. There is nothing in India that is not breaking news. Anchor changed his tie, breaking news. And so it's just numbing at this point, and they've lost, in my view, a lot of credibility in terms of taking issues seriously.
So I want to make a plug for, there's one essay on media in the book by Suhail Seth, whom many of you know. It's actually very well written, especially for Indian media. Originally, the title was Indian Media Mad Dog or Watchdog.
Yeah.
But we were advised to change it. So the
Well,
title
that's
is now much more...
probably apt.
So, but I want to ask you a question, yes/no question for all of you before we open it up. On election day, which is May 16th, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Indian Standard Time is when the results will be announced. Okay. Will you be watching Fox News, MSNBC, or Pranab? I mean, or Arnab Goswami.
I'll be watching our own channel in India. I'm an alumni.
Oh, I see.
Probably on the
Okay.
internet, on the web,
Okay.
rather than watching any local channel in the United States on this. I think it's actually as infuriating as the coverage may be in India. It's more infuriating watching Americans who know nothing about India, including myself, pronounce things about India. So I won't watch, I'll try not to watch the American coverage of India where they'll stumble along pronouncing names badly and they get the parties wrong, and you know. Is that a little too cruel?
NDTV, that's what I'll be watching.
All right.
I'll be fast asleep. It'll be 10 p.m. And this is one reason I have a lot of trouble with only one thing in Indian culture, which is dinner time.
Okay, so with that, I think, first of all, thank you very much for...
But the ambassador, by the way, makes accommodation for us in Washington. Dinners come a little
Can I
earlier.
make one sentence?
Yeah, please.
One sentence on your question before that. I think that all governments around the world, every one of them, have trouble with the media. It's harder to govern than ever before. Secondly, including Pakistan. Secondly, and that's true of Pakistan, which has as many 24-hour channels as India almost. Secondly, Indian print media are thriving.
Yes.
It's astonishing that as the networks grow, print media is doing very well. There's some relationship between them, but it's quite. Indian newspapers are really much better than they used to be, and their magazines are much better. So I think that's very hopeful.
But the phenomenon of advertorial, if that's the right, is that the right phrase for it?
Well, you pay for the news.
Yeah. That's a trend that I think all of us who care about free media need to keep a close watch on. We don't need any mad dogs, but we need some watchdogs.
Like the clarity and transparency at the sourcing. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, first of all, thank you for being very honest and straightforward in your answers. And I think at this point, I'd like to take some questions from the audience. Can we please put the rules, right? A short question. It has to be a question, no speeches, and please. We'll pass the mic around. I'll come to you. Just introduce yourself and ask the question.
Wolf Gross, and by way of bona fides, Steve Cohen washed up on my doorstep in New Delhi almost 50 years ago. The ambassador in his keynote mentioned reimagining Indo-U.S. relations, and somebody very recently asked me, was there a simple way of codifying the relationship? And I said one word: sinusoidal. The problem with the sinusoidal relationship, to continue the metaphor, is that it's out of phase. U.S. interest peaks when Indian interest.
So what would be
is
the
in
question?
valley. And the question is, what can we do to resynchronize that relationship so it's not out of phase?
Strobe, do you want to take, and Steve, do you want to take that?
Well, since Chris gave you the 5 T's and the 5 C's, I'm going to just plagiarize my colleague Tanvi Madan, and I would never come to an event like this without checking in with her and getting my instructions. She's worried about the 5 D's.
All right.
And I have a cheat sheet, obviously. Drift, dilution of importance, disillusionment, differences, and dealing with another democracy. And I think that's a pretty good list. And there's a positive if we can get the opposite of each of those D's. And I have no idea what letter they could all start with.
Okay, thank you. Student, you want to?
I would add another D, that's defense technology, which is something that's been high on India's priority for years. We've been slow to respond we did finally respond, but the guy responsible for that response is gone. There's no little expertise in the Pentagon about this. So defense technology. India wants to acquire American military technology to replace the Soviet military technology to reduce their dependence on Russia. And of course, implicitly, to strengthen its position vis-a-vis China and Pakistan. But I think that we should be providing it, since they're all nuclear weapon states. In a sense, no matter how much conventional technology they have, this isn't going to affect the long-term strategic balance.
Please, you had a question.
I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. Interesting observation that every country in that region says that they are in a tough neighborhood. The other thing is, as Strobe mentioned, the common things between India and USA is diversity and democracy. The third thing, which is very important, is secular constitution. That's another common thing. Secular constitution in both these countries. Secular constitution in both the countries. And about Modi, it's very important because he will not be running a country, he will be running a continent. And then he'll have to deal with the world community of leaders. So I think campaigning and governance, these are two very different things. Let's hope for the best and expect the best from him also.
What would you?
My question is,
yes, please.
Yes, my question is, what stops India, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to deal with the common enemy of militancy, extremism, and terrorism, overcome their skepticism and work together for stability, peace, prosperity, and a better future for the generations of the future?
Stephen, I think this is definitely directed to you.
Well, I was in the Reagan administration, although a Democrat, felt kind of strange there. I would say, but I would quote Reagan and say, trust but verify. The talk about trusting each other is technically bullshit. That's the word I would use. In a sense, Reagan was right. You had to verify agreements. And I've heard it said by a senior official from government, three or four agreements and you have a strategy. In other words, verifying agreements that are already done, getting them done is critically important. Then trust grows out of it.
Could I add
please.
something? And this is directed squarely at Pakistan.
I think the lady behind
And whenever you offer a singular answer to a question as important as yours, it's going to have to be oversimplified. But if I had, a fairy godmother gave me one wish for that region, it would be that powerful circles, and probably the most powerful circles in Pakistan, would pivot, to coin a phrase, away from seeing India as the principal threat to Pakistan, and would look to forces inside of Pakistan itself as the single biggest threat to Pakistan.
the lady there.
Okay. Hello, I'm Sudha Garg, and I would like to thank the panel for your very insightful comments about India. So there's a lot of conversation about how the world views India, and also there was a comment about India underestimating its role and power in the growing world economy. But what I didn't hear about a lot in the conversation was, how does India itself view its role in the world? Or maybe that view hasn't been clearly articulated, and India has been somewhat inward looking. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Could I take one?
Please, absolutely.
You've accurately and clearly, up to a point, captured something that I said. But I would say India should properly, I hope will properly and fulsomely understand its role, not only in the world economy, but in what could be called the governance of the world. That is, what are the rules in the world? And it wasn't a surprise, but it was still a disappointment to me when India decided to abstain in the United Nations General Assembly on the condemnation of what the Russian Federation did in Crimea. I would think that India would have an acute interest in reinforcing rules against unilateral secessionism and unilateral annexation of territory. That should be a global norm, And I hope that in the future, India will find ways of reconciling that with its foreign policy.
Okay. Can I recognize Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who's at the IMF and was Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank?
Thank you, Adil. I have two questions actually, very quick ones. One, you talked about the section on women in the BJP manifesto. One of the NDTV countrywide polls, state by state, showed a huge difference of women not wanting to vote for the BJP. It is a very unusual difference actually. I've never seen such a difference in any poll in terms of preference for against one party
Between
and
genders,
opposed to
yes.
others.
Okay.
So that's a question. I don't know if any of you have observed that, and what do you ascribe that to, and what will that mean for if a BJP government comes in?
You want to? Why don't
Well,
you answer?
I'm only going to speculate, and therefore please don't take this as an intelligent response. Let me give you that caveat. I would speculate that if you, on the one hand, are seen as quite business friendly, you may not be seen as, and I don't want to fall prey to gender stereotypes, but you may not be seen as family friendly or as human friendly if you're business friendly. And so I don't know if that's part of the issue, but what I would ask, the question I would ask in follow-up research to get at the why is what perception do they have either out of understanding or lack of understanding of their platform puts them off. And my guess would be, and what I would probe would be, is that notion high ground of business friendly somehow not resonating with women in India?
Rakesh, I'd be very interested if you had your own answer to that question. Seriously.
Yes.
Yeah,
No.
Seriously.
it's just there's not an area in which I would express any expertise. I was just so struck by it. But my guess is only that the huge macho image that is being provided by the leader would presumably put women off. But that's we've got nothing to do with the manifesto because no one reads the manifesto except for all of you. So a second very different question to do with really the normalization of relations in the neighborhood. That since I just recently completed, here's a plug, completed a national transport policy for the long term. One big element of that is normalizing transport between all of South Asia. Because what we found is that the South Asia region is among the least interconnected regions in terms of trade. So the question is that we've proposed, look, you must open up all the borders as far as transport is concerned. Do you think that's a possibility in the next 20 years? Because that would really, if you improve, if you connect up the whole South Asia region to roads, railways, civil aviation, everything, then presumably that will make a lot of difference in non-government contact. But do you think any possible next 20
So you mean
years?
Bangladesh, Burma,
Bangladesh,
Nepal, Bhutan,
Burma, Nepal,
and Pakistan,
and Pakistan.
and Afghanistan through that?
True, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the movement of trade, water, and people and ideas through the subcontinent could recreate South Asia. Essentially, it's fragmented into parts. I wrote a book about this, Shooting for a Century. I'm very pessimistic this is going to happen, but it's in their logic to do it. And I think that's where American policy should be, encouraging regional integration cooperation to just revive the notion of a subcontinent. Ironically, the term South Asia was only created in the 1960s. It's a fairly new term. And the first foreign government to use the term was Germany. At Heidelberg created a South Asia center. So it's not, in America we still see, we put it this way, we divide South Asia into responsibility for it in Pacific Command, in charge of India and Bangladesh, and CENTCOM, in charge of Pakistan. So in a sense, we have it bifurcated in our military commands as well as elsewhere in our government.
Yep. I'll come to you at the back in a minute. Just please.
But cricket and Bollywood really do unite the subcontinent.
This has been a fascinating discussion. And
Just introduce yourself.
yeah, my name is Shabbir Poonawala, and I'm a retired real estate developer. Isn't it true that the greatest impediment to growth in India is the infrastructure or lack of it? And the second part of the question is, does India have an eminent domain law that we have in this country, which probably prevents the infrastructure development?
So I'll take it and I'll ask for help from my friend, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who looked at infrastructure for 25 years, right, in different areas. So I'll just answer the first part, the second part of it, right? Which is India has an eminent domain law that applies in certain cases, but the issue, anything to do with land in India, the acquisition of land by the government, the compensation for the land by the government, then the clearance of titles, etc., by the government has been actually quite a complicated thing and created huge numbers of problems. So it's not that the government can't say we need this land, but the basis on which it does it and the compensation that is paid for it has been subject of incredible debate, problems, and led to a new law on land acquisition by governments, even for infrastructure projects. In terms of, so anyways, and you know, by the way, that's one of the things that's slowing down 183 major infrastructure projects in India that are worth, you know, $100 billion or something like that. So it's a big issue. I'll just make one comment, and perhaps Dr. Mohan, you can also comment on, why don't you start and comment on, is infrastructure adequate, not adequate, and is it slowing down growth?
The infrastructure is clearly inadequate. I don't think there's any question of that. The only footnote I'll do to that is that it has had a tremendous improvement in the last 20 years. It's just that aspirations are far ahead of the kind of improvement that's taken place. The one area where it has not improved as much as is the railways. And in part of our work, what we found was, which I didn't know before and did the work, is that until the late 90s, so say through the 1990s, there was a roughly equal investment in roads and railways, about 0.4% of GDP a year. In the 2000s, after the National Highway Development Project was announced by the NDA government in 2000, and the Prime Minister's Rural Road Program, that went up around 1% of GDP over the next 10 years. It's now 1.1 or thereabouts. Railways has remained the same. So the point is that among the key issues in infrastructure, which is really lacking, which is, despite the fact that it's the oldest part of infrastructure, is investment in the railways. And without adequate investment in railways, you'll have problems in energy production because you've got to transport the coal, which is totally clogged now. There's no way that we can have an economic growth in the next 20 years without huge investment in the railways. And that is in some sense not actually even realized adequately.
There's also, I might submit, as an individual experiencing infrastructure in India, so I've been back twice in the last 6 weeks, and a couple of experiences. One, when I lived in Asia for 12 years, traveled everywhere, worked everywhere, and we used to have amongst business people and media what we'd call the airport index. and you could go to a third-tier city in China and they'd have a brand new airport. Not so until very recently in both Delhi and Mumbai. In fact, I just flew out 1 week after they opened the new terminal in Mumbai. So
I missed it by a week before.
Here's the problem, though. Two experiences in the last 6 weeks for me in India, I would say. One, I was on that beautiful, it felt like a 10-lane highway in Rajasthan coming back to Delhi. We were the only car on the highway. I asked why. They said, well, it's a toll road and it's too expensive. So one is policy matching up with infrastructure, because here was a brand new ghost 10-lane highway. You could almost smell the cement curing. You know, it was so new, so beautiful. Nobody on the highway. Second, the Delhi airport, the new terminal for international. Beautiful. I show up. I show them my smartphone. They say, ticket, please. There's actually still a military guard out front. And they say, ticket. And I showed him my smartphone, and he looked at me and he said, ticket, as though I couldn't understand him. And I said, no, it's an e-ticket. And he said, ticket.
Paper ticket, right.
And I couldn't get into the airport without a printout of the ticket. So it's not just the infrastructure.
What did you do?
I asked him, well, we broke all the rules. I said, please take me to security. I'm sure they'll understand. He brought back the manifest of every passenger on the plane and asked me to circle my name on the manifest.
That's it. That's a backup.
Complete breach of all security.
That's plan B, right?
That's plan B. They improvised. But so my point is, it's not just the infrastructure. It is the mindset to use the infrastructure in a 21st century way.
Go ahead.
Yeah, when I went to a place called Pudong years ago, and it was a ghost town, and they said to me, Chinese said to me, there will be a city here. And I went back a couple of years later, there was a city there. I think India's 20 years behind China in terms of infrastructure. That's what Boeing told me when I wrote my book on India, Emerging Power, and I think that's about where it's at. So go back 20 years from now, you'll be able to read your smartphone.
And China's probably a bit more brutal in terms of eminent domain, I would suggest.
Yeah, put it in the well.
It's a bit of a problem.
Like there is none.
I'm sorry, you will have to move this entire city.
Now, I do want to just comment on infrastructure. While there's been a huge amount of improvement, and there are lots of interesting examples of even within the current system of everything, right? The government, the courts, the bureau, all sorts of things. There are some incredible successes, and so if you could just replicate those, it would work. One success that people actually are not aware of is the Rural Roads Program. The Rural Roads Program basically builds a 1.5 lane road to a village that is tarred as opposed to just mud, right? And a fair amount of money has gone into it in the Bharat Nirman program over the last 10 years. And it has made a huge difference. It's on schedule. There are tens of thousands of kilometers of roads that have been built. And if you have a village that didn't have a road and you put a road into the village, the GDP of the village goes up by 25% in 1 year, right? Because now you can send goods much further. And so this is completely implemented by the states, to your point. It's only central government funding, I think, right? Central government funding, but all execution is at the state level. And it's actually been a huge success. And it has changed more people's lives than the 4-lane highways every year. So even within all of these problems, actually, there are some great successes. Let me go to the back because I've only been looking in the front. Let's go all the way to the back. Last row.
Hi, my name is Abizer. I'm from Houston. And this question was WhatsApp from India. My brother-in-law is driving around a church gate, and he says, how will USA do healthy business with the Modi government if there is a visa embargo?
5 minutes.
Could you
Just repeat the question, sorry?
Yeah, I don't think the microphone was working.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Abizer. I'm a businessman from Houston. And my brother-in-law is WhatsApping this from Churchgate in Mumbai right now as we speak.
Thank you.
And I told him, don't ask silly questions, this is Brookings, but he said, ask them anyways. He says, and by the way, he says that people on the street are thinking this. He's saying, how will the USA do healthy business with the Modi government if there's a visa embargo on him?
Well, if he's PM, there won't be a visa
embargo. Forget it.
Yeah.
It's a good question because we have a definitive answer.
Yeah. Not
Okay,
even close.
Last question at the back, please. Oh, sir, you've been raising your hand many times with the green. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Rock Zhang from ECCO of China. And I have a question about what do you think, the panelists, do you think China should learn from India? Because there are many kind of research to say that China's development model now has run out of gas because it's heavily rely on investment, infrastructure and trade export, and its lack of democracy to some extent when compared with India. Although the two countries all have about more than 1 billion population. So, what in your view China should learn from India, and vice versa?
You used the word democracy. But in order for China to be convinced that that's something to learn, it's got to be a democracy that functions even better than it does now, with less corruption and with more efficiency. But I think that is the one-word answer. One of the interesting pieces of the global context here is that every single system of government in the world, whether it's authoritarianism, monarchy, constitutional monarchy, traditional Western democracy as it is in other parts of the world, or state capitalism, none of them are working very well right now. We have a global crisis in governance of all kinds, and I think as the largest democracy, India, and as the oldest democracy, the United States, need to put their heads together on making both of our versions of that system work, not least because it'll be an example to others, a more compelling one than it is now.
China's got to rebalance, as everybody knows, its economy from export to a domestic consumption economy. I'm not sure if India is the best example, but India is one of the world's best examples at improvisation, as the ambassador said. Probably better improvisers than China is. And one last thing, China is huge on basketball and badminton. It needs to learn cricket.
There's a very interesting question. If China learns cricket, the one sport in which India is pretty good, it might not be that good anymore. Please don't learn cricket. I guess I do want to comment on this as an Indian, which is, to be honest, I don't think a lot of people in India spend any time thinking about what China can learn from India. We spend a lot of time thinking about what can we learn from China, to be honest, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of what all has happened. So I don't think this is something that has had a lot of debate, right? So we have to make it up a little bit. Perhaps the ambassador who also served in China for a long time could comment on it. The only thing that I can think about is, India's learned to live with chaos. Probably better than almost any other country. And maybe you have to learn how to live with a little bit of chaos.
Just a little bit, though.
Just a little bit, not too much. Otherwise, anyway, let's. I know there are a lot of questions, but we have a tight deadline for the panelists. I'd like to thank the panelists for being pretty open and debating, and I hope it's been useful for the group. Thank you for coming, and thanks to Asia Society
Thank you.
and Brookings and the ambassador.